Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of humanity's most profound stories of faith, promise, and the birth of nations. We're talking about Abraham and Sarah, a tale that goes far beyond just an elderly couple waiting for a child. And before we start, just a heads up, you probably think you know this story. Not because it is simple. Well, maybe it seems that way on the surface. But if you really dig into what theologians, historians, and storytellers have been wrestling with for millennia, you'll realize this isn't just about infertility and divine promises. It is about radical obedience, the birth of monotheism, covenant relationship, and the weight of being chosen to father entire civilizations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving deep into stories that have shaped three major world religions and continue to resonate in our modern understanding of faith and family. Also, I'd love to know what city you are watching from, and what is your take on trusting in promises that seem impossible. Do we have the capacity for that kind of faith? Or is that beyond human capability? Now dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the ancient city of Ur, where the great Euphrates River wound through fertile Mesopotamian plains, there lived a man named Abram. The year was approximately 2100 BCE, and Ur was a bustling center of civilization, complete with towering ziggurats, advanced irrigation systems, and a complex society that worshipped multiple gods. Among this sophisticated but spiritually confused culture, Abram stood out as a man of unusual character and growing wealth. Abram's name meant exalted father, which carried a certain irony that would have been apparent to anyone who knew him well. At 75 years old, this man who was destined to be an exalted father had no children of his own. He lived with his beloved wife Sarai, whose name meant princess, and together they had built what most would consider a successful life. Their household was substantial, filled with servants, livestock, and the accumulated wealth of decades of careful stewardship. But success, as Abram was learning, doesn't always equal fulfillment. Despite his material blessings, there was a restlessness in his spirit, a sense that the gods of Ur, with their demands for ritual sacrifice and their apparent indifference to human suffering, were not the complete answer to life's deepest questions. Sarai, too, felt this spiritual hunger, though hers was complicated by the very personal pain of childlessness, in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear sons. It was during this season of quiet questioning that something extraordinary happened. The voice of the one true God broke through the spiritual noise of polytheistic Ur, like a clear bell ringing across still water. The Almighty spoke to Abram with words that would echo through eternity. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Can you imagine the weight of those words? Here was a call that demanded everything, leaving behind the familiar, the comfortable, the secure, for a promise of something greater than Abram could possibly comprehend. This wasn't just an invitation to relocate. It was a summons to become the father of a new kind of people, a nation that would bless all the families of the earth. The remarkable thing about Abram's response wasn't that he negotiated or asked for more details or demanded proof. The scripture simply tells us that Abram went as the Lord had told him. At 75 years old, when most people are settling into their final years, Abram packed up his entire household and set out for a destination he had never seen, trusting in a God who had just introduced himself in the most personal way. But Abram didn't travel alone. Sarai, his faithful companion, chose to join him on this journey into the unknown. Think about what this meant for her. She was leaving behind not just a city, but a way of life. She was leaving behind the familiar rhythms of Ur, the network of relationships that had sustained her through years of disappointment about her childlessness, the comfort of known customs and familiar faces. Yet something in her spirit resonated with the call her husband had received. Perhaps she sensed that this journey held the key to the deepest longings of her heart. They also took with them Lot, Abram's nephew, along with all their servants and possessions. This wasn't a small travelling party. It was essentially a migration of a substantial community. The logistics alone would have been staggering. Imagine coordinating the movement of large flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, camels loaded with household goods, and dozens of people, all travelling across hundreds of miles of ancient wilderness. As they left Ur behind, the city's great ziggurat growing smaller and smaller on the horizon, Abram and Sarai were walking by faith in the truest sense. They had no GPS, no detailed maps, no travel guides. They had only the promise of God and the inner conviction that they were moving towards something infinitely more valuable than what they were leaving behind. Their first major stop was Haran, a city about 600 miles northwest of Ur. Here they settled for a time, perhaps to rest and resupply, or perhaps because Abram's father Terah, who had accompanied them part of the way, was too old to continue. It was in Haran that Terah died, marking the end of one chapter of Abram's life and the beginning of another. The time in Haran was a period of transition and preparation. Abram's household continued to grow, not just in numbers, but in organization and purpose. Sarai proved herself to be not just a supportive wife, but a capable partner in managing their complex household. She demonstrated the wisdom and leadership qualities that would later make her a true mother of nations. But Haran was not their final destination. The call of God continued to beckon them southward toward the land of Canaan. So once again, they packed up their extensive household and resumed their journey. As they travelled, Abram and Sarai must have wondered what they would find in this promised land. Would it be a fertile paradise, a barren wilderness? A land already occupied by hostile peoples? When they finally entered Canaan, they found it to be a land of diverse landscapes, fertile valleys, rugged hills, desert regions, and areas of remarkable beauty. But it was also a land already inhabited by various Canaanite tribes, each with their own territories, customs, and gods. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of settling in an empty land. It would require wisdom, patience, and continued faith in God's promises. At a place called Shechem, near the great tree of Moreh, God appeared to Abram again with a more specific promise. To your offspring I will give this land. This was the first time God had explicitly promised that Abram's descendants would inherit Canaan. It was also the first time God had spoken of Abram having offspring, which must have stirred deep emotions in both Abram and Sarai. In response to this divine encounter, Abram built an altar to the Lord. This simple act was actually quite revolutionary. In a land filled with altars to various Canaanite deities, Abram was publicly declaring his allegiance to the one true God. The altar became a testimony to his faith and a marker of God's promise. From Shechem, they continued their journey, moving gradually toward the hill country between Bethel and Ai. Here, Abram built another altar and called on the name of the Lord. These altars weren't just religious monuments, they were statements of faith, declarations that despite being strangers in a strange land, Abram and Sarai were confident in God's promises. As they settled into the rhythm of semi-nomadic life in Canaan, Abram and Sarai must have felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. They were living in the promised land, but it didn't yet belong to them. They were part of a great plan, but its fulfillment seemed to require more patience than they had anticipated. They had been promised that they would become a great nation, but Sarai's womb remained closed. Yet there was something about their presence in Canaan that felt right, that felt like destiny. The land itself seemed to respond to their faith. Their flocks and herds prospered. Their household grew. They established peaceful relationships with their neighbours. Slowly but surely they were becoming established as people of significance in the region. But as we'll see, their journey was far from over. The path to becoming the father and mother of nations would involve tests of faith that would push them to their limits, adventures that would take them far from the promised land, and encounters with God that would transform not just their names, but their very identities. For now, though, as they settled into their new life in Canaan, Abram and Sarai could rest in the knowledge that they had been obedient to God's call. They had left everything familiar and comfortable to follow a divine promise, and they had discovered that God's plans, though mysterious, were always worth the journey. The evening stars over Canaan shone with the same light that had guided them from Ur, and in that light they could see the faint outline of a future that would exceed their wildest dreams. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to become the ancestors of a people who would indeed bless all the families of the earth. Life in Canaan had settled into a pleasant rhythm for Abram and Sarai. Their tents were pitched in the shadow of ancient oaks, their flocks grazed in fertile pastures, and their household bustled with the activity of a thriving semi-nomadic community. But just as they were beginning to feel established in their new homeland, a crisis emerged that would test their faith in ways they had never imagined. A severe famine began to grip the land of Canaan. What started as a delay in the seasonal rains gradually became a full-scale drought. The grass withered, the wells ran low, and the very land that God had promised to give to Abram's descendants seemed to be rejecting their presence. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a life-threatening situation that forced Abram to make a difficult decision. Looking toward the south, toward Egypt, Abram knew that the great Nile River made that land less dependent on rainfall. Egypt had always been a refuge for Canaanites during times of famine, and now it seemed to be their only option for survival. But this journey to Egypt would be different from their migration from Ur. This time, they weren't following a clear divine directive. They were making a survival decision based on human wisdom and necessity. As they prepared for the journey to Egypt, Abram was troubled by more than just the logistics of moving their household again. Sarai's extraordinary beauty, which had been a source of joy and pride throughout their marriage, now seemed like a potential danger. In ancient Near Eastern culture, powerful men often took beautiful women for their harems, sometimes killing their husbands to remove any obstacles. The night before they entered Egypt, Abram approached Sarai with a request that revealed both his human weakness and his deep love for her. "I know what a beautiful woman you are," he said. "When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." This request placed Sarai in an impossible position. Technically, she was Abram's half-sister as well as his wife, so the deception contained an element of truth, but it was still a deception, and it put her in tremendous danger. If she were taken into Pharaoh's household as his wife, she would be separated from Abram indefinitely, and the promises God had made about their future together would seem impossible to fulfill. Yet Sarai's response reveals the depth of her character and her commitment to her husband. She agreed to the deception, not because she was weak or passive, but because she understood the complexity of their situation and chose to trust that God would somehow work through even their imperfect decisions. As they entered Egypt, the contrast with Canaan was immediately apparent. Where Canaan had been parched and brown, Egypt was green and lush. The Nile's annual flooding had left the fields fertile and productive. Cities bustled with commerce and activity. It was a land of plenty, but also a land of complex political hierarchies and potential danger. As Abram had feared, Sarai's beauty did not go unnoticed. Word of the beautiful foreign woman quickly reached the highest levels of Egyptian society. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to their king, and before long, Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's household as his wife. For Abram, this must have been a time of intense inner conflict. On one hand, he was treated very well because of his supposed relationship to Sarai. Pharaoh gave him sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Abram's material wealth increased significantly during this time, but at what cost? His beloved wife was in another man's household, and he was living a lie that seemed to make a mockery of God's promises. For Sarai, the situation was even more difficult. She was living in the palace of the most powerful man in Egypt, surrounded by luxury but separated from her true husband. She had to navigate the complex social dynamics of an Egyptian royal household while maintaining her secret identity and hoping for deliverance. The strength and wisdom she displayed during this trial would later serve her well as the mother of nations. But God had not forgotten his promises to Abram and Sarai. The Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with serious diseases because of Sarai. These weren't ordinary illnesses. They were clearly supernatural signs that something was wrong. Perhaps they were forms of infertility or other conditions that would have been particularly meaningful in a culture that placed great emphasis on royal lineage and divine favor. Pharaoh, who would have had access to the best physicians and magicians in Egypt, quickly realized that these afflictions were connected to the new woman in his household. When he summoned Abram for questioning, his words carried both anger and fear. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." The fact that Pharaoh released Sarai and allowed them to leave Egypt with all their possessions was itself a miracle. In ancient times, kings didn't usually admit their mistakes or allow foreigners to leave with their wealth after creating such problems. But God's protection over Abram and Sarai was so evident that even this powerful pagan ruler recognized that he was dealing with people who were under divine protection. As they left Egypt, Abram and Sarai's entourage was significantly larger than when they had arrived. They had acquired not just material wealth, but also servants, including a young Egyptian woman named Hagar, who would later play a crucial role in their story. Their time in Egypt had been difficult and morally complex, but it had also demonstrated God's faithfulness to his promises, even when his people made imperfect choices. The journey back to Canaan was a time of reflection, and, undoubtedly, deep conversation between Abram and Sarai. They had learned important lessons about faith, fear, and the consequences of taking matters into their own hands. They had also seen God's power to deliver them from impossible situations, and his commitment to fulfilling his promises, despite their weaknesses. When they returned to the altar that Abram had built between Bethel and Ai, they weren't the same people who had left during the famine. They had been tested and refined by their Egyptian experience. They had learned that God's protection extended even to foreign lands, and that his plans for their lives were not dependent on their perfect obedience. Sarai, in particular, had proven herself to be a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. She had navigated one of the most challenging situations imaginable with grace and intelligence. She had protected her husband while maintaining her own integrity, and she had trusted in God's ultimate plan even when the immediate circumstances seemed hopeless. As they settled back into life in Canaan, both Abram and Sarai had a deeper understanding of what it meant to be called by God. They understood that the journey to becoming the father and mother of nations would not be a straight path, but would involve tests, trials, and even failures that would ultimately strengthen their faith and prepare them for the incredible destiny that awaited them. The famine that had driven them to Egypt was over, but the lessons they had learned there would remain with them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that God's promises were not dependent on their perfect behavior or their ability to control every situation. They had learned that even their mistakes could become part of God's larger plan, and that his faithfulness was greater than their failings. Looking back on their Egyptian adventure, they could see God's hand at work in every aspect of their experience. The famine had been a test of their faith, but it had also been an opportunity to see God's power in action. The deception about Sarai's identity had been a moral failure, but it had also led to a demonstration of God's protection and provision. Most importantly, they had learned that their calling to become the father and mother of nations was not just about having children or acquiring land. It was about learning to trust in God's character and promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict those promises. It was about becoming the kind of people who could be trusted with the enormous responsibility of representing God to the world. As they resumed their life in Canaan, Abram and Sarai were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. They had been tested in the crucible of foreign culture and royal politics, and they had emerged stronger and more confident in their divine calling. They were one step closer to becoming Abraham and Sarah, the father and mother of nations, whose faith would inspire countless generations to come. The stars over Canaan seemed to shine a little brighter as they settled in for the night, and in their light, Abram and Sarai could almost see the outline of the great nation that would one day spring from their union. They didn't know exactly when or how God's promises would be fulfilled, but they knew with absolute certainty that they would be, and that knowledge was enough to give them peace as they rested in the land that would one day belong to their descendants. Upon returning to Canaan from their complicated sojourn in Egypt, Abram and Sarai found themselves facing a new kind of challenge, one that would test not just their faith, but their wisdom and character as leaders. The wealth they had accumulated in Egypt, combined with their existing prosperity, had created a situation that would require difficult decisions and mature leadership. Both Abram and his nephew Lot had returned from Egypt with substantially increased flocks, herds, and servants. What had once been a manageable extended family operation had grown into something much more complex. The pastures that had previously been adequate for their needs were now insufficient for the expanded livestock. Water sources that had once satisfied their household were now strained by the demands of their much larger operation. The tension came to a head through the actions of their shepherds. Arguments broke out between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen over grazing rights, water access, and the best camping spots. These weren't just minor disagreements. They were serious conflicts that threatened to divide the family and damage their reputation among their Canaanite neighbours. Abram, now recognised as the senior patriarch of the family, found himself in a position where he needed to make a decision that would affect not just his own household, but the entire extended family. He could have asserted his authority as the older relative and claimed the best land for himself. He could have demanded that Lot submit to his leadership and accept whatever arrangements he decided to make. Instead, he chose a path that revealed both his wisdom and his deep trust in God's promises, approaching Lot with the dignity and grace that would characterize his entire life. Abram said, "Let's not have any quarrelling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." This offer was remarkable in its generosity. According to ancient Near Eastern custom, Abram as the senior family member had the right to choose first. Instead, he gave Lot the first choice of territory, trusting that God would provide for him regardless of which land he inherited. This decision revealed a man who had learned to base his security not on his circumstances, but on his relationship with the Almighty. Lot's response, while understandable from a human perspective, revealed the difference between his character and his uncle's. Looking out over the land, he saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was especially appealing after their recent experience with famine in Canaan. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The narrative notes that this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, a detail that adds poignancy to Lot's choice. He was choosing based on immediate material advantage, not considering the spiritual climate of the region he was entering. The cities of the plain, particularly Sodom and Gomorrah, were known for their wickedness, but their material prosperity made them attractive to someone focused on immediate benefits. As Lot departed with his household toward the Jordan Valley, Abram and Sarai were left in the hill country of Canaan. From a purely material standpoint, it might have seemed like they had gotten the worse end of the deal. The hill country was more challenging to farm and graze, the water sources were less reliable, and the overall living conditions were more demanding. But God had not forgotten his promises to Abram. After Lot had left, the Lord appeared to Abram with words of encouragement and expanded promise. "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." This divine encounter came at exactly the right time, just when Abram might have been tempted to second-guess his generous decision. God reminded him that his inheritance was not limited to whatever portion of land he might claim through human negotiation. The entire land of Canaan was destined to belong to his descendants, and his offspring would be so numerous that they would be like the dust of the earth, countless and widespread. The command to walk through the land was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it would give Abram a better understanding of the territory that would one day belong to his descendants. Symbolically, it was an act of faith and possession, a way of claiming the land in advance of its fulfillment. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. This altar, like the others he had built, was both a place of worship and a public declaration of his faith. It announced to all who passed by that this land was under the protection and promise of the one true God. Sarai, throughout this period of separation from Lot, demonstrated the qualities that would make her a true mother of nations. She supported Abram's generous decision, even though it meant accepting what appeared to be the less desirable portion of the land. She helped manage the transition of their household to their new location, and she continued to be a source of wisdom and strength for her husband. Their new home at Hebron was strategically located and became a place of stability and influence. The great trees of Mamre provided shade and a sense of permanence, while the location offered good access to trade routes and neighbouring communities. It was here that Abram and Sarai would experience some of their most significant encounters with God, and where they would entertain heavenly visitors. The separation from Lot, while painful, had been necessary for the development of both men. Lot would go on to face the consequences of his choice, to live among the wicked cities of the plain, experiences that would teach him hard lessons about the importance of spiritual considerations in decision-making. Abram, freed from the complications of managing an extended family operation, could focus more fully on his relationship with God and his calling as the father of nations. For Sarai, the separation meant a smaller, more manageable household. But it also meant that the promise of descendants seemed even more distant. With Lot gone, there was no obvious heir to inherit God's promises. Yet she continued to trust in God's plan, even when that plan seemed to be taking longer than expected to unfold. The contrast between Lot's choice and Abram's response became a pattern that would be repeated throughout their lives. When faced with decisions, Lot typically chose based on immediate material advantage, while Abram chose based on spiritual principles and trust in God's promises. This difference in approach would ultimately determine their very different destinies. As they settled into their new life at Hebron, Abram and Sarai had no way of knowing that their separation from Lot would soon lead to another test of their faith and character. War was coming to the region, and with it, an opportunity for Abram to demonstrate the kind of leadership and courage that would make him truly worthy of being called the father of nations. But for now, they were content to rest in the shade of the great trees of Mamre, to tend their flocks and herds, and to worship at the altar they had built to the Lord. They had learned that God's promises were not dependent on their ability to secure the best land or the most favourable circumstances. They had learned that generosity and trust in God's provision were more valuable than any material advantage they might gain through selfishness or manipulation. The stars over Hebron shone with the same promise they had offered in Ur, in Haran, and in Egypt. But now Abram and Sarai could see in those stars something more than just distant lights. They could see the faces of the countless descendants who would one day call them father and mother. They could see the outline of the great nation that would spring from their union, and they could see the blessing that would flow from their family to all the families of the earth. As they lay down to sleep in their tent at Hebron, Abram and Sarai were at peace with their decision to separate from Lot. They had chosen the path of faith over the path of material advantage, and they had discovered that God's blessings were not limited by human circumstances. They were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that the one who had called them out of Ur would continue to guide them toward their destiny as the father and mother of nations. The peaceful rhythms of life at Hebron were suddenly shattered by disturbing news that would transform Abram from a pastoral patriarch into a military leader. A messenger arrived at their encampment with breathless urgency, bringing word that war had erupted in the region, and that Lot, along with his family and possessions, had been captured by invading armies. The conflict had begun as a rebellion in the Jordan Valley. For 12 years the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zor had served under the domination of Kedorlaomer, king of Elam. In the 13th year, they had decided to rebel against their overlord, setting the stage for a devastating war that would engulf the entire region. Kedorlaomer had responded to this rebellion by forming a powerful coalition with 3 other kings: Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Tidal, king of Goyim. This formidable alliance had swept down from the north and east, conquering territory and subduing populations as they moved toward the rebellious cities of the Jordan Valley. The coalition's campaign had been systematic and brutal. They had first defeated the Rephates in Ashtaroth Karnaim, then the Zuzites in Ham, and the Amites in Shaveh Kiriataim. They had conquered the Horites in their hill country of Seir, pursuing them as far as El Paran near the desert. Then they had turned back and come to En Mishpat, defeating the Amalekites and the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. When the coalition finally met the combined forces of the 5 Jordan Valley kings in the valley of Siddim, the outcome was decisive. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into tar pits, while the other 3 kings escaped to the hills. The victorious coalition seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and they carried off many captives, including Lot and his family. When Abram heard this news, he faced a moment of decision that would define his character and his destiny. Lot had chosen to separate from him and live among the wicked cities of the plain. From a purely practical standpoint, Abram had no obligation to risk his life and resources to rescue his nephew. Lot had made his choice, and now he was living with the consequences. But Abram's response revealed the depth of his character and his understanding of family loyalty. Despite their separation, Lot was still his relative, still part of his extended family. More importantly, Lot's captivity was not just a family crisis, but a test of Abram's emerging role as a leader who would be responsible for the welfare of many people. Abram's decision to rescue Lot was swift and decisive. He called out the trained men born in his household, 318 of them, and set out in pursuit of the coalition forces. This number tells us something important about the size and organization of Abram's household. To have 318 trained fighters from his own servants suggests that his total household numbered in the thousands, making him a significant power in the region. The pursuit was carefully planned and expertly executed. Abram divided his men into multiple groups and attacked the coalition forces at night near Dan. This tactical decision showed both wisdom and courage. A night attack would neutralize the coalition's numerical advantage and create confusion in their ranks. It was a risky strategy that required precise coordination and exceptional leadership. The battle was a complete victory for Abram's forces. They routed the coalition army, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. They recovered all the goods that had been taken, rescued Lot and his family, and freed all the other captives who had been taken from Sodom and Gomorrah. This military victory established Abram as a major political and military power in the region. He had defeated a coalition of kings that had conquered much of the ancient Near East. His reputation as a leader and warrior would have spread throughout the region, earning him both respect and fear from neighboring rulers. But the most significant moment came after the battle, when Abram was returning home with his rescued nephew and the recovered goods. He was met by 2 very different kings, and his response to each of them would reveal the true source of his strength and the nature of his character. The first king he encountered was Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. This mysterious figure brought out bread and wine and blessed Abram with these words, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Melchizedek's blessing was profound and prophetic. He recognized that Abram's victory was not simply the result of superior military tactics or courage, but was a divine intervention by God Most High, the creator of heaven and earth. This acknowledgement of God's sovereignty over the battle results would have been deeply meaningful to Abram, who understood that his success was entirely dependent on divine favor. In response to this blessing, Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of everything he had recovered. This was the first recorded tithe in Scripture, and it established a principle that would become central to the worship of God's people throughout history. By giving 1/10 to Melchizedek, Abram was acknowledging that God was the true source of his victory, and that all his blessings came from the Most High. The encounter with Melchizedek was a spiritual high point for Abram, a moment of recognition and worship that reminded him of his primary calling and identity. But immediately afterward, he faced a very different kind of test when the king of Sodom approached him with a different kind of offer. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." This offer was both generous and tempting. According to the customs of warfare in that time, Abram had every right to keep both the people and the goods as spoils of war. The king of Sodom was essentially offering to let Abram become incredibly wealthy from his military victory. But Abram's response revealed that his encounter with Melchizedek had clarified his priorities and values. He replied, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. This response was remarkable in its integrity and spiritual insight. Abram understood that accepting wealth from the king of Sodom would compromise his testimony and his relationship with God. He refused to give anyone the opportunity to claim that his prosperity came from any source other than the blessing of God Most High. Sarai, who had undoubtedly waited anxiously during the military campaign, must have been deeply proud of her husband's response to both kings. She had watched him demonstrate courage in battle, wisdom in victory, and integrity in the face of temptation. She had seen him emerge as a leader worthy of being called the father of nations. The rescue of Lot and the encounter with Melchizedek marked a turning point in Abram's development as a leader. He had proven himself capable of decisive action when family members were in danger. He had demonstrated military leadership and tactical skill. Most importantly, he had shown that his ultimate loyalty was to God Most High, not to material wealth or political advantage. For Sarai, this period had been both stressful and enlightening. She had seen her husband risk his life to rescue a nephew who had chosen to separate from them. She had witnessed his transformation from a peaceful patriarch into a military leader. She had watched him navigate the complex political and spiritual challenges that came with victory. But perhaps most significantly, she had seen him maintain his integrity and his faith throughout the entire experience. The man who had been called to be the father of nations had proven that he could be trusted with power and victory. He had shown that success would not corrupt him or cause him to forget his dependence on God. As they returned to Hebron with Lot safely rescued, and their reputation enhanced throughout the region, Abram and Sarai had much to reflect upon. The military campaign had been successful beyond their wildest expectations, but it had also raised new questions about their future. If Abram was capable of such leadership, and was being recognized as a major power in the region, what did this mean for God's promises about making him the father of a great nation? The encounter with Melchizedek had been particularly meaningful for both of them. Here was a priest of God Most High who had recognized Abram's divine calling, and had blessed him as one who was favored by the Creator of heaven and earth. This validation from another servant of the true God had been deeply encouraging, and had strengthened their faith in God's promises. The contrast between Melchizedek's blessing and the king of Sodom's offer had also been instructive. It had shown them the difference between seeking blessing from God and seeking advantage from the world. Melchizedek had offered spiritual encouragement and recognition of God's sovereignty. The king of Sodom had offered material wealth that would have come with spiritual compromise. As they settled back into their life at Hebron, Abram and Sarai were changed by their experience. They had seen God's power demonstrated in dramatic fashion. They had witnessed his protection over their family and his ability to use them as instruments of his will. They had learned that being called to be the father and mother of nations would involve not just personal blessing, but also responsibility for the welfare of others. The rescued Lot returned to his home in Sodom, apparently unchanged by his experience of captivity and rescue. But for Abram and Sarai, the experience had deepened their understanding of their calling and their confidence in God's ability to fulfill his promises. They had seen that God could use them in ways they had never imagined, and they were ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The stars over Hebron seemed to shine with new promise as they reflected on all that had happened. They had started as a childless couple called to leave their homeland for an uncertain future. Now they were recognized leaders in their new land, with a household that numbered in the thousands and a reputation that extended throughout the region. Yet the greatest promises God had made to them about descendants, as numerous as the stars and a great nation that would bless all the families of the earth, still awaited fulfillment. But they were no longer the same people who had left Ur so many years ago. They had been tested by famine and foreign courts, by family conflicts and military campaigns. They had learned to trust in God's provision and to act with integrity even when facing difficult circumstances. They had discovered that God's plans for their lives were far greater than anything they could have imagined. As they lay down to sleep in their tent at Hebron, Abram and Sarai were at peace with their calling and confident in their future. They had proven themselves worthy of the great destiny that God had planned for them. They were ready to become Abraham and Sarah, the father and mother of nations, whose faith would inspire countless generations to come. After the dramatic events of the military campaign and the encounter with Melchizedek, Abram found himself in a contemplative mood. The victory had been complete, his reputation was secure, and his household was prosperous. Yet beneath the surface of these successes, deeper questions lingered in his heart. Questions about the specific promises God had made and how they would be fulfilled. It was during this time of reflection that the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, with words that would address his deepest concerns. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." These words came at exactly the right moment. Despite his recent military success, Abram may have been feeling vulnerable. He had made enemies of powerful kings, and retaliation was a real possibility. God's promise to be his shield addressed this concern directly, assuring him that divine protection would continue to surround him. But the phrase, "your very great reward," touched on something even deeper. Abram had just refused the material wealth offered by the king of Sodom, choosing instead to maintain his integrity and his dependence on God. Now God was assuring him that he had made the right choice, that God himself would be Abram's reward, and that this would be far greater than any material blessing he might have received. However, Abram's response revealed the burden that had been weighing on his heart. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" This was the cry of a man who had received many blessings, but still lacked the one thing that would make all God's promises possible: a son. Eliezer was apparently Abram's most trusted servant, the one who would inherit his estate according to the customs of the time if he died without children. But having a servant inherit his possessions was not the same as having descendants who would fulfill God's promises about making him the father of a great nation. Abram continued, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." These words revealed both his frustration and his faith. He was frustrated because years had passed since God's initial promises, and he and Sarai were only getting older. Yet he was still engaging with God, still seeking understanding and clarification, rather than simply giving up on the promises. God's response was both immediate and dramatic. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." Then he took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And he added, "So shall your offspring be." This moment under the star-filled sky of Canaan was one of the most significant in Abram's life. God was not just reaffirming his promise, he was expanding it and making it more specific. Abram's descendants would not just be numerous, they would be as countless as the stars themselves. The scripture then records one of the most important statements in all of biblical history. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This simple sentence captures the essence of faith and reveals the foundation of Abram's relationship with God. He didn't just intellectually accept God's promise, he believed it with his whole heart, and this faith was counted as righteousness. This declaration of faith was particularly remarkable given the circumstances. Abram was now 85 years old, and Sarai was 75. By any human measure, the time for childbearing was long past. Yet Abram chose to believe God's promise, despite the apparent impossibility of its fulfillment. This was faith in its purest form, trusting in God's character and power, rather than in visible circumstances. But God wasn't finished with this encounter. He continued, "I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it." This reminder of God's past faithfulness was meant to strengthen Abram's faith in his future promises. However, Abram's response revealed that he still had questions. "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" This wasn't doubt so much as a desire for confirmation and understanding. Abram believed God's promises, but he wanted to understand how they would be fulfilled. God's response was to establish a formal covenant with Abram through an ancient ritual that would have been familiar to people of that time. He instructed Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram was to cut the larger animals in half, and arrange the pieces opposite each other, with the birds placed whole. This ceremony was a common way of making binding agreements in the ancient world. Typically, both parties would walk between the pieces of the animals, symbolically calling down upon themselves the fate of the animals if they broke the covenant. It was a solemn and serious ritual that emphasized the gravity of the commitment being made. As the day wore on, birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. This detail may seem minor, but it symbolized Abram's role as a protector of the covenant and his vigilance in maintaining its integrity. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. In this supernatural state, God spoke to him about the future of his descendants. The words were both encouraging and sobering. Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country, not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. This prophecy gave Abram a preview of his descendants' future that stretched far beyond his own lifetime. They would experience both suffering and deliverance, slavery and freedom, exile and return. The promise was not just about having children, but about the grand sweep of history that would flow from his lineage. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, something extraordinary happened. A smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces of the animals. This was the visible manifestation of God's presence, and significantly, God alone passed between the pieces. In making this covenant, God was taking upon himself the entire responsibility. In human covenants, both parties typically shared responsibility for keeping the agreement. But in this divine covenant, God was making an unconditional promise. He was guaranteeing that his promises to Abram would be fulfilled regardless of Abram's performance or worthiness. This was a covenant of grace, not of works. On that day, the Lord made a formal covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephates, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." The specificity of this promise was remarkable. God didn't just promise a land, but defined the exact boundaries and identified the specific peoples who currently occupied it. This was a detailed, concrete promise that could be measured and verified when it was fulfilled. For Sarai, who had undoubtedly been included in Abram's recounting of this extraordinary encounter, the covenant ceremony would have been both encouraging and challenging. Encouraging because God had specifically promised that Abram would have a son from his own body, which implied that she would be the mother. Challenging because the promise still seemed impossible, given their advanced age. Yet the covenant ceremony had demonstrated something crucial about God's character and his relationship with them. He was not a distant deity making vague promises, but a personal God who was willing to bind himself in the most solemn way possible to ensure the fulfillment of his word. The covenant had also revealed something about the nature of faith itself. Abram's righteousness had not come from his perfect performance, but from his willingness to believe God's promises. This principle would become central to the faith of all of Abram's spiritual descendants, that righteousness comes not from works, but from faith in God's character and promises. As they returned to their normal routine at Hebron, Abram and Sarai carried with them the memory of this supernatural encounter. They had witnessed God's presence in a way that few humans ever experience. They had received specific promises about their future and the future of their descendants. They had seen God take sole responsibility for the fulfillment of his covenant, but they also carried the knowledge that God's promises might not be fulfilled in the way or timing they expected. The prophecy about 400 years of slavery suggested that the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises would extend far beyond their own lifetimes. They were part of a story much larger than themselves. This realization brought both comfort and challenge. Comfort because they could rest in the certainty that God's promises would be fulfilled. Challenge because they would need to continue trusting in those promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict them. The stars that had witnessed God's promise to Abram continued to shine over Hebron, and in their light, Abram and Sarai could see not just their own future, but the future of countless generations. They were no longer just a childless couple hoping for a son. They were the beginning of a story that would bless all the families of the earth. As they lay down to sleep after this extraordinary day, Abram and Sarai were different people than they had been that morning. They had seen God's glory, heard his specific promises, and witnessed his unconditional commitment to their future. They were ready for whatever lay ahead, confident that the God who had made such solemn promises would surely fulfill them in his perfect timing. 10 years had passed since Abram and Sarai had first arrived in Canaan, and the promise of descendants still seemed as distant as ever. Sarai, now 85 years old, felt the weight of those years in ways that went far beyond physical aging. Each month that passed without conception was a reminder of dreams deferred and promises yet unfulfilled. The covenant ceremony had been encouraging, but it had not changed the fundamental reality of their situation. In the ancient world, childlessness was not just a personal disappointment. It was a source of social shame and economic insecurity. A woman's value was largely measured by her ability to bear children, particularly sons who could carry on the family name and inherit the family property. Sarai had lived with this burden for decades, and the specific promises God had made to Abram had only intensified her sense of urgency. It was during this time of emotional and spiritual struggle that Sarai made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for their family and for history itself. She approached Abram with a proposal that reflected both the customs of her time and the depth of her desperation. "The Lord has kept me from having children," she said to Abram. "Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." The servant she was referring to was Hagar, the young Egyptian woman who had joined their household during their time in Egypt years earlier. Sarai's proposal was not unusual by the standards of ancient Near Eastern culture. Legal codes of the time, including the Code of Hammurabi, provided for such arrangements when a wife was unable to bear children. The children born to the servant would legally belong to the wife, allowing her to fulfill her social obligations and secure her position in the household. But the very fact that Sarai felt compelled to make this proposal revealed the strain that the long wait had placed on her faith. The woman who had left everything to follow God's call was now struggling to trust in his timing. She was attempting to fulfill God's promises through human effort and cultural customs, rather than waiting for divine intervention. Abram's response to Sarai's proposal was simply, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. This brief statement masks what must have been a complex emotional and spiritual decision. Abram had just received specific promises from God about having a son from his own body, yet he was now agreeing to a plan that seemed to shortcut those promises. Perhaps Abram reasoned that this was how God intended to fulfill his promises. Perhaps he was simply trying to be supportive of his wife during a difficult time. Or perhaps he too was struggling with the apparent delay in God's timing and was willing to try a more conventional approach to building a family. Whatever his reasoning, the decision to take Hagar as a concubine would prove to be one of the most complicated and painful experiences of their lives. It would test their marriage, challenge their faith, and create conflicts that would echo through generations. Hagar, the Egyptian servant, found herself in an impossible position. She had no choice in the matter. As a servant, she was required to submit to her master's and mistress's decisions. Yet she was also a young woman with her own feelings, desires, and dreams. The arrangement that others had made for her would fundamentally change her life and her relationship with the family she served. When Hagar conceived, the dynamics of the household changed dramatically. The scripture tells us that, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. This reaction, while understandable, created a volatile situation that would test everyone's character and wisdom. From Hagar's perspective, her pregnancy had elevated her status in the household. She was now carrying the son that her mistress had been unable to provide. In a culture that placed such emphasis on fertility, this gave her a sense of superiority and importance that she had never experienced before. But from Sarai's perspective, Hagar's attitude was both hurtful and threatening. The plan that was supposed to solve her problem had instead created a new one. The servant who was supposed to help her build a family was now treating her with contempt. The arrangement that was meant to bring her dignity was instead bringing her humiliation. The tension between the two women quickly escalated, and Sarai brought her complaints to Abram. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering," she said. "I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Sarai's words revealed the depth of her emotional pain and her sense of regret about the arrangement she had initiated. She was now experiencing the consequences of trying to fulfill God's promises through human manipulation rather than divine intervention. The very plan she had devised to solve her problems had created new and more complex difficulties. Abram's response to Sarai's complaint was to essentially wash his hands of the situation. "Your servant is in your hands," he said. "Do with her whatever you think best." This response, while perhaps intended to be supportive of Sarai, actually represented a failure of leadership and compassion. As the head of the household, Abram had a responsibility to protect all the members of his family, including Hagar. By giving Sarai complete authority over her, he was essentially abandoning his duty to ensure that justice and mercy were practiced in his household. The result was predictable. Sarai began to mistreat Hagar so severely that the young woman felt she had no choice but to flee into the wilderness. For a pregnant woman to run away into the dangerous desert was a desperate act that revealed just how unbearable her situation had become. This crisis represented a low point in Abram and Sarai's journey of faith. Their attempt to help God fulfill his promises had created pain and conflict for everyone involved. They had allowed cultural customs and personal desperation to override their trust in God's character and timing. But God, in his mercy, had not abandoned any of them. When Hagar fled into the wilderness, the angel of the Lord found her near a spring in the desert and engaged her in a conversation that would change her life. This divine encounter revealed God's heart for all people, not just for those who had received specific promises. The angel asked Hagar, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" When she explained that she was running away from her mistress, the angel gave her both a command and a promise. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." This instruction to return must have been difficult for Hagar to accept. She was being asked to go back to a situation of conflict and mistreatment. But the angel also gave her a promise about her unborn son. "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." The name Ishmael meant "God hears." And it would serve as a permanent reminder that God was aware of Hagar's suffering and had not forgotten her. The angel continued with more specific promises about Ishmael's future. "He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." This prophecy about Ishmael was both a blessing and a warning. He would be strong and independent, but his life would be marked by conflict and tension. He would be blessed with numerous descendants, but his relationship with other peoples would be complicated. Hagar's response to this divine encounter was remarkable. She gave the Lord who spoke to her a name. "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." This was a profound theological insight from an Egyptian servant who had experienced God's personal care and attention. The well where this encounter took place was named Bir Lahai Roi, which means "well of the living one who sees me." This location would become a place of significance in the ongoing story of Abram's family, a reminder that God sees and cares for all people, even those who seem to be forgotten or overlooked. Hagar returned to Abram and Sarai's household and gave birth to a son, whom Abram named Ishmael, just as the angel had instructed. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born, and for a time it seemed as though God's promises might be fulfilled through this child. But the birth of Ishmael did not resolve the underlying tensions in the household. If anything, it complicated them further. Sarai still felt the sting of her inability to bear children, and the presence of Hagar and Ishmael was a constant reminder of her failure. Hagar, despite her divine encounter, still had to navigate her complex position as both a servant and the mother of her master's son. For Abram, the birth of Ishmael raised new questions about God's promises. Was this the son that God had promised? Was Ishmael the one through whom he would become the father of a great nation? Or was there still more to come? These questions would not be answered immediately. For 13 years, Abram and Sarai would live with the ambiguity of having a son who might or might not be the fulfillment of God's promises. During this time, they would continue to grow in their understanding of God's character and his ways. The experience with Hagar and Ishmael had taught them painful lessons about the consequences of trying to fulfill God's promises through human effort. They had learned that God's timing is not always the same as human timing, and that trying to speed up his plans often creates more problems than it solves. They had also learned something about God's character that would serve them well in the years to come. Even when they made mistakes, even when they acted out of impatience or lack of faith, God did not abandon them. He continued to work in their lives, to protect them, and to move them toward the fulfillment of his promises. As they watched young Ishmael grow up in their household, Abram and Sarai were reminded daily of both their humanity and God's grace. They had learned that being chosen by God did not make them perfect, but it did mean that they were loved and guided by one who could work even through their mistakes to accomplish his purposes. The stars over Hebron continued to shine with the same promise they had always held, and in their light, Abram and Sarai could see that their story was far from over. They had learned important lessons about faith, patience, and the complexity of human relationships. They were being prepared for even greater tests and even greater blessings that lay ahead. As they lay down to sleep, watching over their household, that now included young Ishmael, Abram and Sarai were different people than they had been before this experience. They had learned that God's plans are often more complex than human understanding can grasp, but that his faithfulness never wavers. They were ready for whatever new chapters their story might hold. 13 years had passed since Ishmael's birth, and life at Hebron had settled into a rhythm that seemed increasingly permanent. Abram, now 99 years old, had perhaps begun to accept that his story with God might be complete. He had a son in Ishmael. His household was prosperous, and he had established himself as a respected leader in the region. Yet deep in his heart, he must have wondered if the grand promises about becoming the father of many nations would be fulfilled through his Egyptian son. Sarai, now 89, had long since passed the age when childbearing would be naturally possible. The decades of waiting had taught her to adapt to disappointment, to find meaning in her role as Abram's wife and the manager of their large household. Yet she too must have wondered if God's promises had been fulfilled in ways she hadn't expected, or if there were still chapters to be written in their story. It was during this time of settled routine that God appeared to Abram again, breaking the 13-year silence with words that would transform not just their names, but their entire destiny. "I am God Almighty," the Lord declared, revealing himself with a name that emphasized his unlimited power and sovereign authority. "Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." This command to walk faithfully before God wasn't just a general instruction about moral behavior. It was a call to live in conscious awareness of God's presence and to conduct every aspect of life with integrity and devotion. The Hebrew word for blameless didn't mean sinless perfection, but rather wholehearted devotion and integrity of character. God continued with a promise that expanded everything Abram thought he understood about his calling. "I will confirm my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers." The word greatly in Hebrew suggests multiplication beyond human comprehension. Not just numerous descendants, but numbers that would stagger the imagination. Abram's response was immediate and physical. He fell face down before God, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was hearing. This wasn't just reverence, it was the natural human response to encountering the unlimited power and presence of the Almighty. In that posture of complete submission, Abram heard words that would change everything about his identity and his future. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The change from Abram to Abraham was more than just a linguistic adjustment. Abram meant exalted father, which had carried a certain irony during his decades of childlessness. Abraham meant father of many nations, a name that declared God's intentions for his future, regardless of present circumstances. This name change was significant, because in ancient cultures, names were believed to carry prophetic power. By changing Abram's name to Abraham, God was not just making a promise about the future, he was declaring that the future had already been determined. Abraham would become the father of many nations because God had declared it to be so, but God wasn't finished with the promises. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The promise of kings coming from Abraham's lineage was particularly significant. This wasn't just about having numerous descendants. It was about establishing a royal dynasty that would have lasting influence in the world. The everlasting nature of the covenant meant that God's relationship with Abraham's descendants would continue throughout all generations. God also renewed his promise about the land. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. But with these expanded promises came a new requirement, the covenant of circumcision. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. This physical sign of the covenant was to be performed on every male child when he was 8 days old. It would mark Abraham's descendants as God's chosen people, and serve as a permanent reminder of their special relationship with him. The covenant of circumcision would distinguish them from all other peoples and create a visible bond between generations. The seriousness of this requirement was emphasized by God's warning. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. After establishing the covenant of circumcision, God turned his attention to Sarai, and his words must have stirred emotions that had been dormant for years. As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. The change from Sarai to Sarah was subtle but significant. Both names were related to the concept of princess. But Sarah carried a more universal meaning. She would be a princess not just in her own household, but among all peoples. The promise that kings would come from her meant that she would be remembered not just as Abraham's wife, but as a matriarch in her own right. Abraham's response to this promise about Sarah revealed both his faith and his humanity. He fell face down again, but this time he laughed not in mockery, but in amazement at the impossibility of what God was promising. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? This laughter wasn't doubt. It was wonder. Abraham was marveling at God's power to do what seemed humanly impossible. Yet his next words revealed his concern for Ishmael. If only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Abraham's heart was torn between wonder at God's new promises and love for the son he already had. He had invested 13 years of his life in raising Ishmael, and the thought of this new promised son potentially overshadowing his first son caused him concern. God's response addressed both Abraham's wonder and his concern. Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. The name Isaac meant laughter, which would serve as a permanent reminder of the joy and amazement that surrounded his promised birth. God's specification that his covenant would be established with Isaac clarified that while Ishmael would be blessed, Isaac would be the son through whom the covenant promises would be fulfilled. But God didn't forget Ishmael. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. This promise about Ishmael was generous and significant. He would not inherit the covenant promises, but he would still be blessed with numerous descendants, and would become the father of a great nation. The 12 rulers mentioned would later be understood as the 12 tribal leaders of the Arab peoples. However, God made it clear that the covenant would be established with Isaac. "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." The timing was specific and non-negotiable. Within a year, Sarah would give birth to the son of promise. This wasn't a vague future hope, it was a definite appointment with destiny. When God finished speaking with Abraham, he went up from him, leaving Abraham to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. The man who had been called Abram was now Abraham, the father of many nations. The woman who had been called Sarai was now Sarah, the mother of nations. And within a year, they would have a son who would be called Isaac Laughter. Abraham's response to these revelations was immediate and complete obedience. That very day, he took his son Ishmael, and all the males in his household, those born in his household, and those bought with his money, and circumcised them, just as God had commanded. The circumcision of his entire household was a massive undertaking. Abraham was 99 years old, and Ishmael was 13, and all the male servants and their sons had to undergo the procedure. This wasn't just a religious ritual, it was a complete transformation of their community identity. For Sarah, learning about her new name and the promise of a son must have been overwhelming. After decades of barrenness, after the painful experience with Hagar and Ishmael, she was now being promised that she would bear a son within a year. The woman who had been called princess was now being called the mother of nations. The promise that kings would come from her was particularly significant. In ancient cultures, royal lineages were typically traced through the father, but God was specifically promising that Sarah's descendants would include kings. This elevated her status from being merely the wife of a great man to being a great woman in her own right. As Abraham and Sarah settled into their new identities, they carried with them the weight of expanded promises and the certainty of their fulfillment. They were no longer just hoping for a son. They were preparing for one whose birth was scheduled for the following year. The covenant of circumcision had marked their household as belonging to God in a permanent and visible way. Every male in their community now bore the sign of God's covenant, a constant reminder of their special relationship with the Almighty. The stars over Hebron shone down on a household that had been transformed by divine encounter. Abraham and Sarah were no longer the people they had been that morning. They had received new names, new promises, and new certainties about their future. They were ready for the final chapter of their long journey toward parenthood, and their ultimate destiny as the father and mother of nations. As they lay down to sleep, Abraham and Sarah were filled with anticipation, unlike anything they had experienced before. They had specific promises with specific timing. They knew that within a year, their lives would be forever changed by the birth of a son who would be called Isaac Laughter. They were ready for the miracle that would transform their laughter of amazement into the laughter of joy. The heat of the day was beginning to settle over the plains of Mamre, when Abraham looked up from his tent and saw 3 men approaching. In the ancient world, hospitality was not just a virtue but a sacred duty, especially in the harsh environment of the desert where travelers depended on the kindness of strangers for survival. Abraham's response was immediate and generous, though he had no idea that he was about to entertain heavenly visitors. Rising quickly from his place by the entrance of his tent, Abraham ran to meet the strangers. His greeting was characterized by the elaborate courtesy that marked ancient Near Eastern hospitality. "If I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree." The offer of water for washing feet was particularly significant in a culture where people traveled dusty roads in sandals. This simple act of service was both practical and symbolic, representing the host's willingness to humble himself before his guests. Abraham's urgency in providing this comfort revealed his character, a man who understood that true greatness was found in service to others. But Abraham's hospitality extended far beyond the minimum requirements. "Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way," he continued. Now that you have come to your servant, the visitors agreed to his request, and Abraham sprang into action with remarkable energy for a man of his advanced years. Hurrying into the tent, Abraham found Sarah and said, "Quick, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." A seah was a substantial measure, about 7 quarts. So Abraham was ordering enough bread for a feast, not merely a light refreshment. This generous provision reflected both his wealth and his commitment to honoring his guests properly. While Sarah set about preparing the bread, Abraham ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf. He gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it for the meal. Abraham himself brought curds and milk along with the calf that had been prepared and set these before his visitors. As they ate, he stood near them under the great oak trees of Mamre, ready to serve their every need. The scene painted here is one of abundance and careful attention to detail. Abraham's household was clearly well organized and prosperous, capable of producing an elaborate meal on short notice. Yet the patriarch himself took a servant's role, standing ready to attend to his guests' needs. This behavior demonstrated the profound respect for hospitality that characterized the best of ancient Middle Eastern culture. As the meal progressed, one of the visitors asked a question that would change everything. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" The question was direct and personal, unusual for travelers, who might be expected to observe social protocols more carefully. Abraham's response was simple: "There, in the tent." What happened next revealed the true nature of these mysterious visitors. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," the visitor declared, "and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." These words carried the weight of divine promise, spoken with an authority that transcended human prediction. Sarah, who had been listening from the tent entrance behind Abraham, responded to this pronouncement with laughter. It was not the laughter of joy, but of incredulity, and perhaps a touch of bitterness. At her advanced age, she was well past 90. The idea of bearing a child seemed not merely unlikely, but impossible. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" she thought to herself. Her laughter was understandable from a human perspective. Sarah had lived for decades with the unfulfilled promise of children. She had watched other women bear sons and daughters, while her own arms remained empty. The monthly cycle of hope and disappointment had finally ended years ago, and she had made her peace with childlessness. Now, to have this hope rekindled by a stranger's words seemed almost cruel, but the visitor's response revealed knowledge that no ordinary human could possess. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child now that I am old?" The question penetrated not just her actions but her thoughts, causing Sarah to feel exposed and perhaps frightened. In a moment of very human weakness, she denied her laughter. "I did not laugh." The visitor's reply was both gentle and firm. "Yes, you did laugh." There was no condemnation in the words, only the quiet certainty of one who sees all things clearly. Then came the words that would echo through the ages. "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." This question, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" struck at the heart of faith itself. Sarah's laughter had revealed her struggle to believe that God could do what seemed impossible by natural standards. Yet the question challenged her to consider whether her God was limited by the same constraints that bound human experience. The encounter at Mamre represented a turning point in the long journey of Abraham and Sarah. For 25 years they had carried the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. Yet Sarah's womb had remained closed. They had tried to fulfill God's promise through human means, with painful consequences that still affected their household. Now, when all natural hope had died, God was declaring that the impossible would become reality. The months that followed the divine visitation brought a mixture of anticipation and apprehension to Abraham and Sarah's household. Sarah found herself caught between the natural skepticism of a woman well past childbearing years and the growing awareness that something extraordinary was happening within her body. The changes were subtle, at first a different energy, a renewed vitality that seemed to contradict her advanced age. As the seasons turned, the impossible began to manifest in undeniable ways. Sarah's body, which had been barren for decades, began to show the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. The transformation was not merely physical, but emotional and spiritual as well. The woman who had laughed in disbelief was slowly being transformed into someone who could embrace the miraculous. Abraham watched these changes with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. His own faith had been tested and strengthened through countless trials, but this was different. This was the culmination of a promise that had sustained him through years of wandering and waiting. As he observed his wife's transformation, he was reminded once again that God's timing was perfect, even when it seemed impossibly delayed from a human perspective. The pregnancy progressed against all natural expectations. Sarah, who should have been weakened by her advanced age, seemed to gain strength with each passing month. Her laughter, which had once been tinged with skepticism, gradually transformed into something approaching joy. She began to speak of the child, not as an impossibility, but as a certainty, a gift from the God who specializes in bringing life from death. The community around them watched with fascination, and perhaps some skepticism of their own. Abraham and Sarah were well-known figures in the region, and their childlessness had been a source of quiet sorrow for many years. Now, to see Sarah clearly with child at her age was cause for both celebration and amazement. As the time of birth approached, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She remembered the day Abraham had first shared God's call to leave their homeland and follow divine leading to an unknown destination. She recalled the promises of land and descendants that had seemed so certain in the beginning, but had grown dim through years of waiting. She thought of Hagar and Ishmael, and the pain that had entered their household through their attempt to fulfill God's promise through human means. The complexity of their family situation had not disappeared with her pregnancy, but there was a sense that God was working to bring good from even their mistakes. When the time came for Sarah to give birth, it was as if the very heavens rejoiced. The child arrived exactly as the divine visitor had promised, healthy, strong, and unmistakably a gift from God. Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was 90 when their son was born, making the birth a miracle that defied all natural explanation. Sarah's first words upon seeing her son were filled with wonder and joy. "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The laughter that had once been skeptical had been transformed into the laughter of pure joy. The name they gave their son Isaac, meaning laughter, would forever commemorate this transformation. Every time they spoke his name, they would be reminded of Sarah's journey from doubt to faith, from despair to joy. The circumcision ceremony on the 8th day was a celebration unlike any other in Abraham's household. This was not merely the continuation of a covenant practice, but the fulfillment of a promise that had been 25 years in the making. As Abraham performed the ritual that marked Isaac as a child of the covenant, he was acutely aware that he was participating in the unfolding of God's plan for all humanity. The feast that followed was generous and joyful. Neighbors and servants alike participated in the celebration, marveling at the miracle child who had been born to parents of such advanced age. The story of Isaac's birth would be told and retold, becoming a testimony to God's faithfulness and power. But even in the midst of celebration, there were complications. Ishmael, now a teenager, struggled with the attention being given to his half-brother. The dynamics of the household had shifted dramatically with Isaac's arrival, and tensions that had been dormant began to surface. Sarah, protective of her miracle child, became increasingly concerned about Ishmael's influence. She had not forgotten the pain of the earlier years, when Hagar had treated her with contempt during her pregnancy. Now, with Isaac as the clear heir to Abraham's covenant promises, Sarah's maternal instincts led her to view Ishmael as a potential threat to her son's inheritance. The tension came to a head during Isaac's weaning feast, a celebration held when the child was approximately 3 years old. Sarah observed Ishmael mocking Isaac, and her protective instincts flared. She approached Abraham with a demand that would test his heart. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Abraham was deeply distressed by Sarah's demand. Ishmael was his son too, and despite the complications surrounding his birth, Abraham loved him. The prospect of sending away Hagar and Ishmael was painful beyond measure, yet God spoke to Abraham in his distress, confirming that Sarah's instincts were correct regarding the divine plan. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman," God told Abraham. "Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." The years that followed Isaac's birth were among the happiest in Abraham and Sarah's long lives. The boy grew strong and healthy, displaying intelligence and character that brought joy to his elderly parents. Isaac became the center of their world, the living proof of God's faithfulness and the hope of future generations. Abraham delighted in teaching Isaac about the God who had called them out of Ur, who had made promises that seemed impossible, and who had proven faithful in every generation. The boy learned the stories of their journey, of the covenant God had made with Abraham, and of his own miraculous birth. Sarah, meanwhile, revelled in the role she had thought would never be hers. Motherhood at her age was a constant reminder of God's power to bring life from death, hope from despair. She watched Isaac grow with the intensity of someone who had waited a lifetime for this gift. But then came the test that would define Abraham's legacy forever. One day, God spoke to Abraham with a command that seemed to contradict everything he had previously promised. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The words hit Abraham like a physical blow. Isaac was not just his beloved son, but the child through whom all of God's promises were to be fulfilled. How could God ask him to sacrifice the very gift he had given? How could the covenant continue if Isaac died? Abraham's response revealed the depth of his faith. Early the next morning, he cut wood for the burnt offering, saddled his donkey, and took Isaac and 2 servants toward the place God had indicated. He said nothing to Sarah about the divine command, perhaps sparing her the agony of knowing what was required. The journey to Moriah took 3 days. 3 days during which Abraham wrestled with the implications of God's command. His faith had been tested many times before, but never like this. Every step toward the mountain was a step of faith, trusting that God would somehow fulfill his promises, even if it meant raising Isaac from the dead. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the place in the distance. He told his servants to wait while he and Isaac went ahead to worship. His words to them revealed his faith. "We will worship and then we will come back to you." Even facing the prospect of sacrificing Isaac, Abraham believed that both he and his son would return. As they walked up the mountain together, Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice, while Abraham carried the fire and the knife. The boy, now old enough to understand the requirements of sacrifice, asked the question that pierced his father's heart. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response was both truthful and faith-filled. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." The words carried both the weight of divine promise and the anguish of a father's heart. When they reached the place God had designated, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. Then, with hands that must have trembled, he bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. The boy, now understanding what was required, submitted to his father's will, displaying a faith that matched Abraham's own. Abraham raised the knife, prepared to obey God's command regardless of the personal cost. But at the crucial moment, the angel of the Lord called out, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Looking up, Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. God had indeed provided the sacrifice, just as Abraham had told Isaac. He took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The place was named "The Lord Will Provide," and it became a testimony to God's faithfulness for generations to come. The experience at Moriah marked the climax of Abraham's journey of faith. He had been willing to sacrifice even his most precious gift in obedience to God's command. And in doing so, he had demonstrated the kind of faith that would become the foundation for all who follow God. When Abraham and Isaac returned to their servants and made their way home, they found Sarah waiting with the mixture of relief and concern that marks a mother's heart. She had sensed something significant in their departure, and their return brought both joy and questions that would take time to answer. The years that followed were peaceful ones for Abraham and Sarah. Isaac grew into a man of character and faith, prepared to carry on the covenant promises to the next generation. Sarah lived to see her son mature, experiencing the deep satisfaction of a mother who had raised her child well. When Sarah died at the age of 127, Abraham mourned her deeply. She had been his partner in the journey of faith, the one who had laughed in disbelief and then laughed with joy. Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on in Isaac, and in the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. Abraham's purchase of a burial cave for Sarah was significant beyond its practical purpose. It was his first permanent acquisition in the promised land, a declaration of faith that his descendants would indeed inherit the land God had promised. The cave at Machpelah became the family burial place, a testimony to their confidence in God's promises. As Abraham himself aged, he took care to ensure that Isaac would marry within the covenant community. He sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives, understanding that the continuation of the covenant required not just physical descendants, but spiritual ones as well. The servant's successful mission brought Rebekah into the family, a woman of character and faith who would become the mother of the next generation. When Isaac met Rebekah, he was comforted after his mother's death, finding in his wife a partner who could help him carry forward the covenant promises. Abraham lived to see his grandchildren born, and to know that the promise of descendants was continuing to unfold. When he died at the age of 975, he was buried beside Sarah in the cave at Machpelah, surrounded by the love of his family and the certainty of God's faithfulness. The story of Abraham and Sarah is ultimately a story about faith, about God's faithfulness, and about the power of divine promises to transcend human limitations. Their journey from the comfortable city of Ur to the uncertainties of nomadic life in Canaan mirrors the spiritual journey that all believers must take from security in the familiar to trust in the divine. Sarah's transformation from skeptical laughter to joyful laughter represents the journey of faith itself. Her initial inability to believe that God could do the impossible gave way to the wonder of experiencing the miraculous. Her story encourages all who struggle with doubt to remain open to God's surprising ways of working. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac demonstrated the ultimate expression of faith, the willingness to trust God, even when his commands seemed to contradict his promises. This act of obedience became a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice that would one day be made on behalf of all humanity. Together, Abraham and Sarah became the father and mother of nations, not just through their physical descendants, but through the spiritual legacy of faith they established. Their story continues to inspire believers to trust in God's promises, to remain faithful through seasons of waiting, and to believe that nothing is too hard for the Lord. The covenant promises made to Abraham and Sarah extend far beyond their immediate family to encompass all who share their faith. They became the ancestors not just of a nation, but of a spiritual family that spans all cultures and generations. Their legacy reminds us that God's promises are trustworthy, his timing is perfect, and his power can bring life from death, hope from despair, and joy from sorrow. In the end, the story of Abraham and Sarah is our story too. The story of ordinary people called to extraordinary faith, of promises that seem impossible but prove to be certain, and of a God who remains faithful across all generations. Their laughter, their tears, their struggles, and their triumphs echo through the centuries, reminding us that the God who called them out of Ur continues to call his people today to lives of faith, hope, and divine purpose.